We extend our warm welcome to you, Ram. Mr. Ramachandra Guha is an eminent historian, environmentalist, and I call him an activist too, having a passion for cricket. He has authored a long list of books on Gandhi, on the history of India, nature, environment. I was trying to Google this morning to check the list of books that he's written, and it's really so long. And many of his books have also been translated to many South Indian languages. So I couldn't keep account of those. So Ram, you may be able to tell me that later. We, the organizers, that include the Mumbai Marathi Patrakar Sangh, Press Club of Mumbai Press Club, Vanashakti, Sanctuary Nature Foundation, and Participatory Urban Design and Development Initiative, and the family of late Darryl de Monte, are indeed privileged to have you amongst us, Ram, to deliver the third De Monte Memorial Lecture. The first memorial lecture in the year 2023 was delivered by the noted environmental economist, Dr. Pavan Sukhdev, who told us, and I quote, "Nature does not send us invoices." The second memorial lecture last year was delivered by Sunita Narayan, a distinguished environmentalist and a determined fighter, told us the need for urgent intervention in the ongoing environmental injustices. I would like to now call upon Swati Gosalkar, the Vice President of the Mumbai Marathi Patrakar Sangh. Are you here? Yeah, hi. Welcome. To welcome Ram and felicitate him. Would you like to say a line? We are very thankful to you, Swati Gosalkar, for supporting this memorial lecture and providing us with this incredible infrastructure in the hall. I now call upon our friend, Bittu Sahgal, from the Sanctuary Foundation, to welcome Ram, and maybe a few lines from you. Yeah.
We're all here sitting in this room. We've had people like Ram come and speak with us. I'm thinking of Darryl, and I can just say this to you, that Darryl told me a very long time ago that he said that, activists and things. I said, I'm not an activist, I'm just an editor. So he says, do you tell the truth? So I said, yes, I tell the truth. So he said, then you're an activist. So that's where we are right now, and I cannot think of anybody better that I would like to listen to than Ram. He's an activist with a mind. He's an activist with determination. I'm referring to you as an activist because you tell the truth. And apart from anything else, he can see way into the future, and that really is the problem with most of us who are in this profession. We can look further, so we're thinking of long term, while most of the rest of the world wants everything today. Instant coffee, instant development, instant everything. Yeah. But nature doesn't work that way. I'm not going to take any more time. Ram, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You are greatly admired.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Bittu. I now welcome Mr. Samar Khadas. Are you here? The president of the Mumbai Press Club. Okay, Gurbir will do that on behalf of the press club.
I am not Samar Khadas, I'm Gurbir Singh. But just on behalf of the Mumbai Press Club, just because Mumbai Press Club has played a major role in setting this up, inviting people, so on. So we would like to felicitate Mr. Guha. Most welcome. Thank you. Just a small book of all the photographers who worked day and day and day night, and during the day. During the COVID period, many of them passed away. And in their honor, Rafiq and a few others put this together as a memento. Thank you.
Thank you. May I invite Meenakshi Menon from the Vanashakti.
Well, I'm having a real fangirl moment, so pardon me if I gush, but Dr. Guha has been one of those people who you look up to, because today in India, there's one very critical part of the body that seems to have disappeared. Anybody can take a guess? Spine. That's right. And Dr. Guha is a man with an incredibly strong spine. And I think he stands as a beacon for all of us to understand that if there's one thing you need to be upright and stand tall, it's a spine. And that's what I would really encourage everybody in this room. Whatever you do, whether you're an activist, whether you're a journalist. Incidentally, I read about journalists and politicians. Do you know when it comes to trust and believability, they are at the same level in 5 countries, 5 European countries and the US. It's like 6% of the people trust their politicians and about 8% trust journalists. So we know where we are headed. But thank you for being here with us. I'm not going to take any more time. I've already got him to sign his book, and those of you who want to get an authorized copy, autographed copy, please buy a copy of the book. They have done my bit. Thanks.
Thank you, Meenakshi. I will not be able to call upon all others who have contributed significantly to the successful organization of the Darryl de Monte Memorial Lectures and been involved with the logistics, which has been so well put together. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, all the staff and the members of the Mumbai Press Club and the Marathi Patrakar Sangh. Thank you. I'll just say a few words in memory of Darryl. My dear friend, and of course, a friend of many of us here, who knew him so well and worked closely with Darryl. Remembering Darryl, 3 important socio-environmental matters comes to my mind. The first is an understanding of neighborhoods and the right to the city. Darryl firmly believed in a bottom-up process for which he actively engaged in neighborhood-based citizens' movements and considered that as an effective democratic means for the achievement of the right to the city. He never hesitated to be on the streets. There's a long list of social and environmental issues and movements in which Darryl actively participated and made significant contribution. The proposal to build, for example, the first NIBM headquarters in the sea, in the waters off Carter Road, and then abandoned by the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi due to the opposition that Save Mumbai Committee, Kisan Mehta, Darryl, and others fought against. And there's a long list of, let's say, the Rashtriya Chemicals and Fertilizers plant in Thalvaisat, the Coast Road plan for Mumbai, which we now see having launched, inaugurated, and we are using that. The reclaiming of the seafronts and other public spaces in Bandstand, Carter Road, Juhu, and other places of Mumbai. And the most importantly, the reinvigoration of the watercourses of Mumbai. Darryl had an extraordinary ability to engage not just with the area and local area social and environmental concerns or battles, but had this ability to relate to the larger national and global environmental perspective. I think that really was remarkable about Darryl. The second matter that relates is the nature-people relationship crisis. And Ram, you've talked about it, you've written quite extensively about this even in your recent book. and through analyzing and writing about the 10 in the book, that a close relationship between people and nature must form the basis of socio-environmental movements is what Darryl firmly believed in and pursued. The nature and extent of this relationship is a matter of deep concern in this era of climate crisis, particularly when this intertwined and interdependent relationship between people and nature is severed in multiple ways by the ruling dispensation. The increasing polarization, for example, on one hand, and the continuing attack on natural areas and the ecology and biodiversity on the other. Take a snapshot of the environmental crisis we are experiencing in Mumbai, for example, a phenomenon that is similarly witnessed across Indian cities. Governments and private developers are spearheading policies that allow construction of buildings over the entire plot area, leaving no ground open space. As a result, existing trees are brutally hacked and done away with, and neither leaving any opportunity for planting new trees in the future. Authorities ignore the fact that loss of trees has serious impact on our health and well-being of the planet. Soon, for miles together, we will experience a cleaned-up concrete cityscape with violence against nature and people underwritten into it. In lieu of the loss of trees, city governments are on an overdrive mode, decorating our cities with lotus-shaped fiber vases, displaying artificial plants, and lighting them with multiple colors of green, white, and orange. Surely, trying to remind us of our nationalism and securing our sense of nationalism. The third in the line of three is the idea of common property resources. You two have discussed this quite a bit through many of the sections in your book, Ram, particularly when we're discussing Radha Kamal Mukherjee and what he wrote and said. That formed the essence of Darryl's thoughts and writings, that land and other natural resources are common property and must be reclaimed and utilized for larger good, not captured and privatized. Today, land is being swept away from under our feet, being gifted free to private developers under the guise of development. Cities are being rapidly privatized, now going beyond the setting up of gated communities to promoting the idea of chartered cities, a much larger plan or phenomena of exclusion and colonization. There is a lot to speak about Darryl, the editor, the committed environmentalist, and a dear friend. However, I'll be brief. As editor of the Indian Express and the Times of India, he wrote many critical pieces that discomforted the management of the newspapers and the government too. During both these tenures, he encouraged and inspired many young reporters and journalists to write on environmental issues, amongst others. He founded the Federation of Environmental Journalists of India and spearheaded it for years. He went on to make it a part of the International Forum of Environmental Journalists, of which he was the chairperson. He was the founder of PUDI, a trust that is also joined hands with the other organizers to host the Darryl de Monte Memorial Lectures. Two books written by Darryl are important readings: Temples or Tombs, Industry versus Environment. That's the first book. And the second, Ripping the Fabric, The Decline of Mumbai and its Mills. Reading Ramachandra Guha's recently published book, Speaking with Nature, The Origins of Indian Environmentalism, Meera Ben comes as a big revelation to me personally, and must be to many of you, I'm sure, particularly when she opposes Nehru for promoting big dams. Nehru portrayed the big mega projects as temples of modern India, Interestingly, Darryl in his book, Temples and Tombs, published way back in 1985, showed, and I quote, how these modern-day temples or big mega projects as portrayed by Prime Minister Nehru turned out to be the tombs placing a huge burden on people. The case studies he cited in the book, Temples or Tombs, also showed an undercurrent of violence against people of small means and the environment, unquote. Darryl did not view development merely as an economic goal, but as a multi-dimensional concept encompassing economic as well as political, social, and cultural aspects of life. In his book, Ripping the Fabric, The Decline of Mumbai and Its Mills, published in the year 2002, Darryl wrote about how the cotton textile mills and Girangaon, the very heart of Mumbai then, once a cultural and economic hub of the city, was being ripped apart violently at the cost of people. The gentrification that followed the murder of the mills has devastating environmental consequences too, which today we are seeing and witnessing. Today, public mind is under siege, and popular imagination cramped by the prevailing model of urban development that is synonymous with building more phenomena, which I keep saying it's a build more syndrome, pursued at the cost of colossal damage to the natural ecology, despite the severity of climate crisis and its consequences. To reflect on this environmental crisis and to discuss our way forward, it is important we continue with Darryl de Monte Memorial Lectures to bring forth views and ideas of persons of stature in the environmental ecological field so that we can listen, reflect, and deliberate together. This is a way to remember Darryl, but also a way to take his legacy forward. Thank you all. Over to you, Ram.
Thank you, PK. Thank you all for coming here. It's a great privilege and honor to speak in memory of Darryl de Monte. Many of you here knew him better than I did. I did know him for a period of years, and we had several long conversations, and of course, also correspondence. And it strikes me that in my fairly long experience of knowing people across all walks of life, not just journalism, but all walks of life, Darryl was distinctive and almost unique in combining three characteristics very rarely seen together: professional excellence, professional and personal integrity, and finally, personal charm. So these three very rarely go together. They sometimes work in contradiction. So the people of the fiercest personal and professional integrity are also charmless because they tell you how to behave better. And I think that was in some ways one of Darryl's, as I said, I wouldn't say unique, but almost unique combination of these three characteristics. And I'll just tell you a story about his personal charm, which I experienced. I'll talk about then I'll go on to why we need to remember Darryl much beyond his personal charm. I was trying to get hold of, one of my visits to Mumbai, I was trying to get hold of Dom Moraes, for the reason that I was writing a biography of the maverick anthropologist, very irrelevant, who had been an early mentor to Dom. In fact, very relevant features in My Son's Father, as someone who encouraged the young Dom's poetry. So I was trying to get hold of him, and Dom Moraes then lived not far from where I am in the yacht club, somewhere in Colaba, and I had a number. Now the problem was, I knew he lived in that flat with his then wife, but neither Dom nor Leela came to answer the phone. It was usually a young acolyte, very drunk, probably as drunk as Dom, but not as worthy of carrying his liquor, and pretending to be Dom. So I would phone and I said, I want to speak to Dom Moraes, and there would be this young boy, younger than me, who would pretend, oh, I'm busy, I can't meet you, and so on. So this went on for 3 or 4 days. And I was absolutely, you're talking about I'm talking about the early 90s, and I was on a relatively modest budget. I had to meet Dom. Of course, I was finding other stuff in Apollo Bandar on Verrier Elvin, including in the OUP archives, then lovingly tended by Rivka Israel, who happens to be here. But I wanted to meet Dom. And I walked in that trip, I walked into the office of the resident editor of the Times of India. You will remember that office, a wonderful wood-paneled office. And Darryl, I'd then known him for about 8 or 9 years. He said, Ram, you're looking anxious. What happened? He said, I'm trying to get hold of this chap, Dom Moraes, and I can't get hold. He said, I will get hold of him. He happens to be my first cousin. So when I call, he answers the phone. No acolyte answers the phone. Now, what he did tell me, and then, of course, I interviewed Dom, but what Darryl did tell me later, which he told me much later, was it actually took some amount of personal charm for even Dom Moraes' first cousin to get hold of Dom Moraes. Because there was a deep family backstory which Zareen knows, and some others know about why Dom would not even talk to the gentle, kind Darryl for a very long period of time. So, this is, to me, the mark of Darryl. This combination of these three qualities. Look around you to people you've known and count yourself deeply fortunate if there is actually a human being, man or woman, Indian or not Indian, who has embodied these three distinct qualities together. Now, when I was asked to give this lecture, I was trying to reflect on when I first read Darryl. And I'm almost sure it was in the late 1970s. And it was a series of articles he wrote on the Jharkhand movement. Now, I can't recall whether these were published in the Illustrated Weekly or the Indian Express. But there were articles on the Jharkhand movement, which was then getting quite active. And actually, the Jharkhand movement in the late 70s, the Jharkhand movement starts in the late 30s as the Adivasi autonomy movement. And there are people here, activists from Adivasi areas who know the history of the movement much better than I. But the late 70s, it actually also took on a kind of environmental twist. Because part of the movement was opposing the planting of the exotic teak species at the expense of the sal forest. And there was even a slogan in the English rendition, I don't know what it was in the original Adivasi language, it went something like, teak means Bihar and sal means Jharkhand. So I remember reading that. So as I was reflecting, coming here, I remember that's the first time Darryl's writing struck me. And it's not surprising, because much later in a conversation, casually he told me, by which time we were friends, he said, Ram, by the way, I'm an Adivasi of Bombay. And which is actually factually true, because he's an East Indian, and there are several other East Indians in this room. So he had, as do the other East Indians in this room, a better claim to being the indigenous inhabitants of Mumbai than anyone else. So that is one aspect of Darryl, and so he was an Adivasi of Bombay. But how I met him tells a different story about Mumbai and why it's such a great city. I first met Darryl. I'd read him, and I'd not met him. And I met him through the intervention of a quite extraordinary non-Adivasi resident of Mumbai, a quite extraordinary non-Adivasi editor of Mumbai, who actually combined those three characteristics of professional excellence, professional integrity, and personal charm. And that was the late Krishna Raj of EPW, who was from a Malayali, who came here via Delhi and the Delhi School of Economics, made this city his home, and ran, I think, with what was for decades India's most important journal and magazine of ideas and reportage. And Darryl walked into Krishna Raj's office and said, I am abandoning journalism because I've got a Homi Bhabha fellowship and I want to work on the environment. And Darryl's graph was then rising, and it would have been a reasonably radical thing to do. And Krishna Raj said, you should contact this young man in Bangalore. He's doing a PhD on environmental history. And that's how we met. So it was a meeting, and it was, of course, by then I had known Krishna Raj and already been mentored by him. But in that meeting, it tells you something about Mumbai, and also about the profession of journalism. And whatever the surveys might say about journalists, and they are journalists and they're journalists. And the only lesson I can tell you about being a journalist in India, I'm a column writer, and not really a journalist, but I'm a column writer. The only truth I can offer to you from 40 years of 60 years of reading newspapers and 40 years of writing for many newspapers across India is that if you want to be respected, if you want to respect yourself, forget whether you want to be respected in the profession. If you're a journalist, the first thing you should do is work as far away from Delhi as possible. Now, and again, while thinking about this talk, and what I owe to the great editors of Mumbai, both people I have known, like Darryl and Krishna Raj, many people in this room whose work continues to nourish and inspire me, and you'll excuse me if I don't single you out by name, but all of you know what that means. And I also go back to people from long before our time. My own journey as a historian, I think the first Mumbai editor who shaped it was the late Benjamin Guy Horniman. Right. Now, so I think that's, to me, Darryl stands in that great tradition of independent-minded, fearless, decent Mumbai editors and writers from Horniman through Krishna Raj, through Darryl De Monte, and many other people in this room. So thank you for calling me here. I am going to speak on the three waves of Indian environmentalism. That's what I've called my talk. And it will present a kind of a broad brush overview of what I consider to be the three waves of the Indian environmental movement. And I might focus, for various reasons, most on the second wave and least on the third wave. But as a historian, when one has to look at a phenomenon like environmentalism, or feminism, or socialism, or any other popular social movement one wants to study, one is faced immediately with the question of origins. When does Indian environmentalism begin? One answer to that question, or when Indian environmentalism begins or began, was offered to me when I was taking a walk in an oak forest outside the city of Shimla. And in that oak forest, there was a placard, a sign as you entered. It was a lovely oak forest. And the placard said in Hindi, and then I'll translate it for those of you who don't know Hindi, it said, कहते हैं वेद पुराण, कहते हैं वेद पुराण, बिना वृक्ष के नहीं कल्याण. It is said in the Vedas and the Puranas, without a healthy forest cover, there is no human welfare. Now, so the claim in that government proclamation was making is that the Hindus invented environmentalism. Now, there are several problems with that claim. The first is you will find Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Muslims, etc., also pointing to various odd select verses in their scriptures and claiming that they were the original environmentalists. That's one problem with the claim. The second problem with the claim is if the Hindus were indeed the original environmentalists, why are the Himalayas so devastated and why is the Ganga so polluted under what we are told is the most Hindu of governments? But the most important reason to reject that claim, to say that environmentalism has nothing to do with ancient religious tradition, whether Hindu or Christian or Buddhist or Islam, is that from the point of view of a historian, environmentalism as a social movement, environmentalism as a philosophy of life and action, is possible only after the Industrial Revolution. It's only the conjunction of three phenomena that take place in the 18th and 19th centuries: large-scale industrialization based on fossil fuels, large-scale urbanization based on the agglomeration of people living around factories in cities, and imperialism, the conquest of the whole world by European imperialists. It's the conjunction of these three factors: fossil fuel-based industrialism, the creation of mega cities, and imperialism, which gives you the political and technological, which gives one country or one particular civilization, in this case European civilization, the power to control, dominate, exploit, and plunder the resources of other countries. That gives birth to the thought in the mind of sensitive human beings, that human beings, through their new technologies, their new forms of economic growth, their new forms of settlement, may actually destroy the earth and their own possibility of living on it. So this is, I think, a very important conceptual point, which I underline as a historian. It is true that in the pre-modern period, you may have had mystics who communed with nature and, tread gently on the land. It is true that in the pre-modern period and well into modernity, including in India, you would have had tribal and peasant communities who would have used their natural resources, their forests, their water, their pasture, their medicinal plants, caringly and sustainably. But the idea that this was a civilizational crisis, that human beings needed to think in a kind of almost at a global scale about how their life was unfolding and what horrible things the future may foretell for them, that really comes with the modern industrial society. And again, to sum up what I've already said, what the industrial and urban revolutions coupled with Western imperialism did was they brought to human use and abuse new resources, new technologies of extraction, massive production systems which didn't exist before, massive living agglomerations like cities of 10 and 15 and 20 million people, new technologies of transport and communication, new noxious elements entering the atmosphere, and all this cumulatively had a massive impact on environment and society. The pace of change accelerated manifold. The devastation of forests, of habitats, the fouling of the air and the water, and also, at the same time, there was a colossal increase in human population growth because of new medical technologies, which allowed people to live longer. And if I was to give a one-sentence definition of the industrial and urban revolutions that start in Europe and then go to North America and then come to Asia and so on, a one-sentence definition would be: these new technologies of production, consumption, and lifestyle really meant more people, because of population growth, more people producing more, consuming more, excreting more. That's a one-sentence definition of the urban industrial revolution. More people producing more, consuming more, excreting more, and hence, for the first time in human history, you have a perception of a civilizational environmental crisis. So environmentalism is born from industrialization. Environmentalism is a philosophy, as a way of thinking about the world, as a way of looking ahead towards a more caring, a more sustainable future in which not just your generation but future generations are brought in, is really a distinctively modern phenomenon, and it has nothing to do with the Vedas or the Bible or the Buddhist texts or anything else. Okay, now, environmentalism is a dynamic social response to the conjunction of social and intellectual response to the conjunction of these three factors: fossil fuel industrialization, large-scale urbanization, and imperialism. And in a book I published some years ago, I argued that the case can be made that because the Industrial Revolution started in England, arguably the first environmentalist was William Wordsworth. And in his poems you can see an anticipation of the destruction that industrialization was wreaking on British society and ecology. Similarly, in our country, one of the first people to recognize the unsustainability of Western models of industrialization was Mahatma Gandhi. And I'm going to offer you a quote I've used many times before, the first time more than 30 years ago when I discovered it, and I think retains its resonance and its relevance to where we are today. This is Gandhi writing in his journal Young India in December 1928. He says, I quote, "God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization after the manner of the West. God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization after the manner of the West. The economic imperialism of a single tiny island kingdom, that is England, is today, namely 1928, keeping the world in chains. And then this is the last line. If an entire nation of 300 million, which is what India was in 1928, if an entire nation of 300 million took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts. Now, although this is, as I said, a very resonant and telling quote, Gandhi really never elaborated on it. You know, Gandhi had many other things to contend with in his life, many other important social, political, compelling social, political objectives to meet: the freedom of India, the emancipation of Dalits, equality for women, perhaps above all the promotion of interfaith harmony. So his environmentalism was kind of, you could say, instinctive and intuitive and never fully developed. But other people, other contemporaries of Gandhi, working alongside Gandhi, sometimes with Gandhi, sometimes independent of Gandhi, other contemporaries of Gandhi, sometimes foreigners working in India, not just Indians, were really what I consider to be early environmentalists. And in my book, which PK mentioned, my new book, Speaking with Nature, I outlined the views of 10 remarkable pioneering thinkers who I consider to have constituted the first wave of Indian environmentalism, who are responding to the challenges that urbanization, industrialization, and imperialism posed to the fabric of their country and of the ecology that enveloped it. And these thinkers I profile in my book include the poet Rabindranath Tagore, for whom harmonizing human needs with ecological integrity was central to his writing, his educational philosophy, and his activism. Others I write about are the scientists Albert and Gabriel Howard, who were pioneers of organic agriculture, foreigners working in India. The economist J.C. Kumarappa, a close associate of Gandhi, who worked from the 30s to the 1960s on sustainable village economics. And he coined the phrase, another resonant phrase, the economy of permanence, and who incidentally was Kumarappa was a profound influence on the thought of E.F. Schumacher, not so often acknowledged. The naturalist M. Krishnan, whom I grew up reading in The Statesman, who flagged the importance of not just the protection of large species like tigers and elephants, but of overall biological diversity. The spiritualist Meera Ben, who spoke of restoring humanity's relationship with nature. And finally, someone who lived in this city for almost a decade, the social ecologist Patrick Geddes, who was the first professor of sociology in Bombay University, and who wrote more than 20 plans for Indian cities, foregrounding questions of sustainability in the urban context. So, my new book is about this cohort of thinkers. I have chosen 10, and inevitably in a work of this kind, questions arise as to why you excluded so-and-so and so on. But I hope that at least these 10 give you a sense, these 10 and their ideas and their writing and their activism, gives you a sense of why I think they qualify to being called early environmentalists and why I consider to be first wave Indian environmentalists. Now, however, and this is in many ways the fate of all radical dissenting thought, that it gets ignored, marginalized, suppressed. So these thinkers were reacting to industrialization and urbanization under the Raj. And they were wondering, they were all broadly sympathetic to the ideals of the freedom struggle. So they all wanted India to be politically free of British subjection. And the questions they were asking were, when we become politically free, what kind of economic, institutional, technological model will we adopt? Will we blindly emulate Western models of industrialization, which are highly centralizing, which consume a great deal of energy, which favor the use of capital over labor, and so on and so forth. Right. And they were asking these questions in a variety of spheres. And in my book, I document that the detail, the nuances and the specificities of their anxieties and worries on this sphere. Yet they were writing, all of them collectively were writing against the grain. Because the dominant consensus in the Indian freedom struggle, which was at one level understandable, was the view that the British colonized us because they were technologically more powerful than us. And once we become free to hold our own in this world that will emerge of new independent nations, to hold our own, we must beat them at their own game. We must build large steel mills. We must have massive urban conglomerations. We must have nuclear power plants. We must have large dams. And urbanization and industrialization is the way, firstly, to end mass poverty, and secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, to secure our political and economic independence in a complex and difficult world. And of course, the world that India entered into after independence was the world of this ferocious superpower rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. So this conclusion that we had to best the West at their own game and maybe take the best of the Western model of industrialization and the Russian model of industrialization was kind of, you could understand why those, it's a kind of view, by the way, broadly speaking. The view that urbanization and industrialization on a LED-intensive centralizing model was the way forward for India is broadly the view of Nehru, Subhash Bose, and B.R. Ambedkar. So I mentioned three extraordinary Indian thinkers, none of whom one can fault for their patriotism or their integrity or their honesty or their concern for the poor. That is how they saw it, because that's how the world looked at that time. And the views of the Gandhians I've talked about, like Kumarappa or Tagore or Miraben or Geddes, were seen as kind of interesting but possibly eccentric. So you had a period running from the late 1940s when India becomes independent to 1973, when environmental concerns go underground. They are submerged by the dominant consensus of the time, which favors a certain style of urban and industrial development in which environmental constraints are ignored or regarded as irrelevant. And it's in April 1973 that Indian environmentalism is reborn, this time not in the shape of intellectuals and writers like Tagore and Kumarappa and Geddes, but in the shape of a popular social movement, the Chipko Andolan, which started in Garhwal in 1973. And all of you know the basic facts about Chipko. It began in the upper Alaknanda Valley when a group of villagers in a hamlet called Mandal stopped a group of commercial loggers from felling a patch of hornbeam forest. And then these protests spread across Garhwal and Kumaon, across Uttarakhand, and of course then acquired a fairly a large visibility nationally and internationally. Now, I started my professional career as a student of the Chipko movement. I wrote my doctoral dissertation and first book, in large part on what Chipko represented. So you'll allow me to go back to the themes of where I began and to present them in a kind of contemporary context and to remind ourselves, and perhaps those of you who haven't studied Chipko carefully or were born after Chipko started 50 odd years ago, to remind ourselves of why Chipko was so important, why it occupied and still occupies such an important symbolic and substantive place in the imagination of the Indian environmental movement. And I'm going to outline 7 reasons why Chipko remains of compelling significance to us today. The first, that it was authentically indigenous. It was a product not of international pressure, but a creation of self-motivated peasants. It was bottom-up environmentalism. It was, to coin a phrase, an environmentalism of the poor, not an environmentalism of the aesthetically minded affluent middle class. Now, it's not coincidental that in the same spring as Chipko, the spring of 1973, Project Tiger begins. Project Tiger is conceived and implemented, which is top-down environmentalism, and also influenced by global pressure. The World Wildlife Fund, protect the tiger, because that's the national animal. Chipko is, by contrast, it's, again, I prefer the term environmentalism of the poor. Those of you who are comfortable with social science jargon may want to call it subaltern environmentalism, versus elite environmentalism of the Project Tiger variety. That's the first reason Chipko was important. These were really often unlettered men, women, and children from a peasant background. The second reason Chipko is important, or was important, is that its historic and cultural associations were instantly recognizable. It took place in the watershed of the Ganga, which is not just of religious significance because of the Char Dhams in Uttarakhand, but because it is the water reservoir of all of northern India. All the major rivers originate there. And then it was also the idea of a non-violent protest on a Gandhian model. Incidentally, two things about Chipko. I mean, it's, one of the things that somewhat embarrasses people like me and occasionally offends me is if I write anything for the press on Chipko, they'll have with it an illustration of people hugging the trees. Actually, no one ever threatened to hug a tree. Those are all post photographs. Trees were never hugged in pursuit of the Chipko movement. Merely the threat was politely issued to the loggers. If you come into the forest, we will stop you physically, but non-violently. And of course, the non-violence evokes images of Gandhi, and these images are burnished by the fact that some of the most charismatic leaders of the Chipko movement had been trained in the Gandhian tradition. People like Radha Bhatt, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, Sundarlal Bahuguna. So that's the second reason Chipko is important, that it evokes, some very powerful images of non-violent protest in the valley of the Ganga. The third reason, which I've already alluded to, is that Chipko articulated a social ecology. It was a movement that raised questions of equity and justice as well as environmental sustainability. What the peasants of Chipko were saying was, the forests are vital as a reservoir of biological diversity, as a protection against soil erosion and floods. There were also issues that I can't go into here about why the Chipko activists said broadleaf species like oak are much more important than pine. The forest department wants to promote pine because it's commercially valuable and adds to the profits of the plywood and paper companies. But broadleaf species are much more valuable in protecting soil erosion, retaining water, and retaining biodiversity. So there was the ecological element of Chipko, but there was also an equity, social justice element. What are the forests for? Are they for the profit of paper and plywood countries, or are they for the companies, or are they for the sustenance of local communities who require those resources for fuel, for fodder, for agricultural implements, for medicinal plants, for sustaining soil and water regimes, and so on. So that's the third reason Chipko is important. It blended environmental sustainability with social justice. Fourth reason Chipko, I think, is occupied that very important place in our imagination is that Chipko began as a movement of protest, but it moved from protest to reconstruction. It was not, an activists, including environmental activists, are often accused of just opposing and not suggesting alternatives. But Chipko very early on showed that they were different. That the first movements were to stop reckless commercial felling. Once these movements succeeded in having the government put a temporary ban on green felling, the activists didn't stop there. Led by a truly extraordinary individual, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, who is much less well known than he should be, largely and merely because he only writes and speaks in Hindi and in English, and he's absolutely averse to publicity. He would never meet a more self-effacing activist of any kind. But he is one of the most visionary thinkers India has ever produced in any field. Please read his autobiography, which is now out in English. It first came in Hindi under the title Gentle Resistance. He was 90 last year, and may his life and especially his legacy live forever. But what he did as part of the movements he led was, he said it's not enough for us to oppose. Let us now look at the barren, degraded hillsides of Uttarakhand and revive and revegetate them. So beginning of the year 1974, and for the next 40 years till he was into his 80s himself, he and his group organized several annual eco-development camps where local indigenous species were planted and nurtured. And 15 years after these camps started, a study by the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore found that in these tree plantation camps of the Chipko activists, survival rates were between 75 and 80%, whereas in the tree plantation camps of the Forest Department, they were 10 to 15%. And, so it was, but Chandi Prasad ji had other ideas about appropriate technology, about how large dams are bad for the Himalaya, but you could have smaller run-of-the-river projects that were more sustainable and would still actually generate much-needed electricity for local communities. So that's the fourth reason Chipko was important. It was not just about protest, but also about constructive work, in the best Gandhian tradition. The fifth reason Chipko was important, that it was representative of many similar conflicts that were erupting in the 70s and 80s across India, which opposed local subsistence requirements versus outside commercial exploitative requirements. So movements against large dams, the Kerala fisherfolk struggle of community fisherfolk versus large trawlers, protests against mining in Orissa and Jharkhand and so on. So the 70s and the 80s, particularly the 70s and the early 80s, saw an efflorescence of grassroots environmentalism of different kinds, and often independently of Chipko, but raising very similar questions about ecological sustainability and social justice. A sixth reason Chipko is important, and movements like Chipko are important, is that it had an impact on policy and legislation. In 1980, the government of India set up a Department of Environment, which 5 years later became a full-fledged Ministry of Environment and Forests, and is now called Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. This would not have happened without Chipko. Parliament had nothing to do with it, universities had nothing to do with it, party manifestos had nothing to do with it. The formal creation of government departments, committed in whatever way, maybe only formally and on paper, to integrating environmental concerns into economic development, is a product of movements like Chipko. And the seventh and last reason is that movements like Chipko were a wake-up call not just to the government, but also to scholars and writers like myself and Darryl de Monte, and dozens of others, including people in this room. So when I was a student, there was no question of courses being taught on environmental sustainability. Today, you will find them in economics departments, history departments, sociology departments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have scientists who are, specializing in hydrology, in soil science, in climate change, and so on and so forth. So it was again quite remarkable that it was these unlettered peasants across India whose protests sparked scholarly, scientific, and journalistic work on environment-related themes. Now, that was the second wave of Indian environmentalism. And one of my hopes for the book I've just written, which is a history of the first wave, is that someone younger, more energetic than me, will write a kind of book on the second wave of Indian environmentalism. It starts with Chipko, carried on for several decades, gives birth to many remarkable organizations, like the Center for Science and Environment, Kalpavriksha, some outstanding scientific research organizations, the Center for Ecological Studies in Bangalore, A3 in Bangalore, a remarkable activist, you think of Chandi Prasad ji, Medha Patkar, many, many others, journalists, Anil Agarwal, Sunita Narayan, Kalpana Sharma, Darryl de Monte, etc., etc., scholars. So I think I've given you, just a brief kind of snapshot of this second vibrant, vigorous, dynamic phase of second wave of Indian environmentalism, which was multifaceted, not just thinkers, but thinkers and activists in social movements, which ran from the 70s till the 1990s, and now comes the gloomy or the bad news, and finally lost steam and more or less disappeared. So the second wave, the first wave, kind of germinates in the late 19th century, has these dissident intellectuals writing, thinking, proselytizing till the 1940s, is vanquished by the second five-year plan or in the Indian development model, Then in the 1970s, you have the rebirth of environmentalism as a popular social movement. That second wave runs from the 70s and 80s till about the early 90s, and as I said, deserves a really good history of its own, which will have many characters, many themes, many sectors, many actors, many controversies. And then it kind of disappears and declines. Just as the first wave disappeared and declined, but in this case, this time for different reasons. Why does the second wave of environmentalism dissipate? Now, one reason obviously is biological. The aging of activists. 20 years in the field, tire and wear you out. Right? And it's hard to sustain that for a very long time. A second reason is the change in our intellectual climate and the embrace of economic liberalization as the governing ideology of the day, starting in the 1990s. Now, there were some important reasons why liberalization was necessary, and there remain some reasons why aspects of economic liberalization were and are to be welcomed and as beneficial for our country and our economy. So liberalization dismantled the license permit quota Raj. It nurtured a climate of entrepreneurship. It raised rates of economic growth. It solved our foreign exchange crisis. So I as a historian, I tend to see things in black and white. There were many important reasons why liberalization was necessary, and in some key sectors it actually worked. But there were other sectors in which it was largely, if not wholly, negative, and environmental sustainability was perhaps preeminent among them, because the market can help you become more creative and more innovative, but it can't stop pollution and degradation. In fact, the market gives you an incentive to degrade more because these are then external to the firm and are not counted in your profit and loss account. And when the environmentalists started raising questions about, they were the only people raising questions about economic liberalization. Why this chemical plant? Why this coal mine? Why this, why that? And are raising questions both about equity and environmental sustainability. This mine is degrading the landscape. It's also dispossessing Adivasi communities. Now, and liberalization in the early 90s and beyond was accompanied by so much hype, and particularly in the press, which kind of transformed itself into cheerleaders of economic liberalization. And it came with colossal promises that if only we opened out the market, India would become Singapore writ large. And it was only the environmentalists asking tough questions. And they quickly were demonized by the media and by the business class. And there was a prominent columnist whom I shall not name, living in Delhi, of course, who I noticed would attack Medha Patkar very regularly, 3 or 4 times a year in her columns. So I've given you a hint. And I started looking at these columns, and then I started noting there was a kind of almost a climatological regularity to them. They came in the height of summer and the depth of winter. Now, if you live in Delhi, I've lived for 10 years in Delhi, right? Now, I was a student there and I worked there. If you live in Delhi, back in the early 90s, before climate change, serious climate change, the summers were brutal. 42, 43, the loo, the dust storm, and the winters were chilling, especially when you stood in the Himalaya. And I thought of this columnist at their desk in Connaught Place, typing out a column and the power goes. So in summer you're sweating, and in winter you're shivering. It's that woman Medha Patkar, she stopped the power to Delhi. Right. Now, I'm only exaggerating slightly, but essentially there was this, apart from the weariness of activists, their aging, their growing inability to attract young cadres to work with them, there was also this savage ideological opposition to them. When, as a result of movements like Chipko through the 80s, people like Darryl came into this field from writing about many other things. Later on, every newspaper had an environmental journalist. By the 90s, that was gone. And perhaps they were all redesignated as stock market journalists. I'm not sure. But essentially, there was a kind of savage ideological attack on environmentalists as anti-development, as anti-growth, as anti-national. There was some of this in the 70s and 80s too, when environmentalists were accused of being CIA agents because of the command and control economy and the so-called socialism of Indira Gandhi years. By the 1990s, they had become KGB agents and holdovers from the socialist past. But the attacks were much more savage. So we had this, there was a history of the second wave of Indian environmentalism, which, as I said, I would love for it to be written, would also involve a chapter on the history of the anti-environmental movement of the 1990s and beyond. Now, which brings me, in the last few minutes of my lecture, to the third wave, which is, I would say, has not yet emerged, but is waiting to be born. I think 30 years of liberalization just have allowed us to see with more clarity what good things it brought us and what evil and deadly things it has also brought for us. I think young people today are much more aware because of the climate change crisis of the perishability of human beings on Earth. And there could be, I hope, a third wave of Indian environmentalism about to emerge. Now, I wanted to say a few things in conclusion. I don't want to predict what this third wave will turn out to be like. Actually, it was kind of PK and others, and Meenakshi and others to call me an activist. I actually don't like that phrase. I'm a writer and a scholar. And my great teacher, Andre Bete, always used to warn me. He said the definition of a public intellectual in India is that he is more public and less intellectual. So I hesitate to be being called an activist, but I hesitate even more looking into the future, because I think historians are not astrologers. So I will not speculate into where this is going. But I want to just alert all of us to where we stand today with regard to the environmental crisis that our country faces, or the many-sided environmental crisis that our country faces. And I want to underline 4 crucial things about the environmental crisis in India today. First, and I think it's maybe especially addressed to young people, but not only to them, even if climate change did not exist, India would be an environmental disaster zone. Our government very adroitly uses climate change and Western hypocrisy to not address any environmental problem at all. Because they'll say the West is hypocritical, we need more coal-fired plants, we don't need any pollution abatement technology, and that's it, right? Now, but let's say climate change did not exist. Consider the problem of air pollution in northern and western cities. There were times last year when Mumbai was more polluted than Delhi, you remember. And of course, in UP, in Haryana, in Punjab, it's not just a Delhi problem. Air pollution in northern and western cities has nothing to do with climate change. The death of our rivers. Historically, all our cities were sited on rivers, and they are biologically dead. This has nothing to do with climate change. The contamination of soil through overuse of chemicals has nothing to do with climate change. The depletion of groundwater aquifers, which are being drawn down so rapidly, even in Maharashtra, Punjab, and so on, have nothing to do with climate change. The degradation of biodiversity, the invasion of our national forests by exotics and so on, have nothing to do with climate change. All of these problems, air pollution, water pollution, depletion of groundwater aquifers, chemical contamination of the soil, decimation of biodiversity, are a result of faulty economic and political policies occurring, planned, executed independent of climate change. That's the first thing I'd like to bring to your attention. The second thing I'd like to bring to your attention is that these varied forms of environmental degradation and abuse adversely affect the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of Indians. We are talking about 4, 5, 6, 700 million Indians who at one level or the other have their health, their livelihoods, their economic opportunities affected by one or other form of environmental degradation. And it is the poor who suffer the most. They bear, in the city and in the countryside, they disproportionately bear the brunt of pollution and degradation caused by these faulty, malign, misguided economic and technological policies. The third factor I'd like to bring to your attention is that although these multiple environmental crises are occurring autonomously of climate change intensifies their impacts and heightens their severity. It is a deadly add-on to a problem that already exists. And this is particularly clear in the Western Ghats in the Himalaya, where you have unregulated mining, haphazard road construction, a reckless expansion of tourist resorts, deforestation, which causes soil erosion, landslides, and then you have an unprecedented weather effect like a flood or heavy rain, and then makes it much worse. So climate change is an add-on, is a deadly add-on to problems that already exist. And finally, the fourth thing I'd like to say is that unlike in the 1970s and 80s when the second wave of environmentalism was active, and certainly unlike in the late 19th century when people like Tagore and Patrick Geddes were writing, today we have in India, in our universities, in our research institutes, including in the work of people in this room, a vast reservoir of scientific and social scientific expertise available within India, which can help us mitigate the human costs of such environmentally insensitive development. In our universities and research institutes, we have ecologists, social scientists, agronomists, hydrologists, urban planners, sociologists, and so on, who combine professional competence of an international standard with deep field experience of social and environmental conditions within India. Sadly, indeed tragically, these domain experts are rarely, if ever, in fact rarely, I would say never consulted by politicians in power. And if they are, their proposals are never implemented, as the bleak case of the Gradgill report showed. This disregard for environmental sustainability of Indian politicians is ecumenical. It operates across parties. The Gradgill report was rejected by the CPM in Kerala, the DMK in Tamil Nadu, the Congress in Karnataka, the BJP in Goa, Maharashtra, and Gujarat. At this insensitivity of our political class to environmental sustainability and its social costs is the product of ignorance as well as malevolence. On the one hand, these politicians are, to invoke John Maynard Keynes, slaves of the ideas of out-of-date economists. Keynes famously said that every man in power is slave to the ideas of some long-dead scribbler, long-dead economist. And of course, most Indian economists have no understanding of ecology at all. On the other hand, Indian politicians are beholden to the mining magnates, infrastructure developers, and factory owners who fund their election campaigns. It must also be acknowledged that the seductions of unending economic growth and ever-increasing consumerism have captured the imagination of the Indian middle class. And from their perspective, environmentalists are not merely meddlesome busybodies, but possibly agents of foreign powers paid to keep India underdeveloped. Now, having said all this, the material conditions for the emergence of a third wave of environmentalism exist. In the range of the decimation and devastation we see, in the people who are impacted, in the brave writers and scholars who still highlight these issues, in the activists and lawyers who try and bring about heroically against the odds changes in policy. So, there are these green shoots for a third wave of Indian environmentalism to begin. As I said 5 or 10 minutes ago, I cannot say what shape it will take, but I would only say this, that it must be aware of the legacy that precedes it, of the first wave and the second wave, and what those waves could do and what they could not do. Thank you very much. The organizer suggested I'll be happy to take a few questions. Sure. Yeah, at the back there.
Hi, Ram. Thanks for a really fantastic address. I wanted to ask, though, why do you say that the third wave is yet to begin, right? Because we've had the 90s, you had the Niyamgiri, POSCO, Kudankulam, the wave of repression as well. that has emerged. You've had virtual, I mean, as well as meeting physical activism. You've had international solidarity for Indian environmental movements. Then we've had the whole wave of, climate emerging after NIMBYism that comes about. And now, of course, we are in a phase where, all of the organizations being shut down, so on and so forth. So it feels like we're almost at a fourth wave where, where we might be losing touch.
So I'd say, I think that's a good point. Maybe I oversimplified. I'd say the third wave, there's some shoots that have not really coalesced into a large-scale movement. If you look at the way in which Chipko and Narmada dominated general discussions even outside the environment, rethinking about development even outside the environmental field. Now, I think there are two reasons why, two hurdles contemporary environmentalists face. One is that we live under a much more coercive regime than the 80s and the 90s, right? So I was talking about this in the morning to some friends. The reckless use, not the reckless, the cynical, deliberate use of provisions like UAPA and other kind of to detain particularly young people, because they want to intimidate young people into not protesting. And the other, I think, is for you to consider. The examples you mentioned, you'll see protests, but you won't see the kind of collective grassroots movements that can bring about hundreds of thousands of people on the street. And I think that is only partly a product of state repression. It's also partly a product of this individualizing technology known as the smartphone. Right. So I think it's for us to consider. And I agree with you. Maybe I oversimplified it. But insofar as you don't have an active rethinking of where we are going, and what are the reasons for that. But as I said, part of it may be the coercion of the state, that across the board, and the whole political economy of the electoral system. I think it's very illustrative that the remarkable Gadgil report was rejected by every state government. Right. So I think, in that sense, I would say that maybe I'm mistaken, but I don't see that kind of same larger cross-cutting national debate and discussions going on that we may have seen in the 80s. Yeah.
Firstly, thank you very much for this very meaningful lecture today. My name is Tenzin. I'm a Tibetan. I live in Himachal Pradesh, in Dharamshala. In these three waves of Indian environmentalism, where does the consciousness of the Indian Himalayas fit in, where the glaciers are melting at huge rates? And because I live in Himachal Pradesh, where we hardly get snow in winter. When we were kids, we used to have this much of snow. We used to play snowballs with tourists. Now there's hardly any snow. And we're all aware of Sonam Wangchuk, the environment activist from Ladakh. He's creating this awareness all around the world about the melting glaciers. Where does that consciousness in India fit in?
You're right. I would say one area, again, that's a partial corrective to what I say. One area in which climate change is most visible is the Himalaya. Right. And it's also one area in which there has been the most reckless development, ignorant of ecological and geological constraints. So, I'm glad you mentioned Sonam Wangchuk because he's a truly heroic figure. But again, it's one wishes more people would take up his thing. But I think road construction and dam building in the Himalaya the Char Dham project is an abomination. It's a ecological, economic, social abomination. And the great Uttarakhandi historian Shekhar Pathak, as he wisely says, what we should do is make tourism into pilgrimage. Instead of which we're making pilgrimage into tourism. And large dams, you have, the flood of 2013 removed some of the dams in the Himalaya. So these are, I would say that it's a sign of how stark and deadly the crisis is, but also a sign of the apathy, or I would say the malevolence of the ruling elite. I'm from Uttarakhand. I was born and raised in Uttarakhand. And the Char Dham project is Horrible for Uttarakhand. It's also bad for tourists, for pilgrims. I mean, you go in a helicopter. Now you go from Dehradun to Kerala in a helicopter and come back. Right? Now, what kind of spiritual experience are you getting? Right? So I think this is a different kind of, even from a spiritual point of view, there's a different kind. I mean, what Solam Vanchuk is telling you is that there's a different kind of relationship that we need to cultivate. Yeah.
If you go through plan documents right from the earliest period, one notices an unequivocal absence of any consciousness of developing urban areas. Developing urban areas and cities in a meaningful scientific way. Why is that so? I mean, is it that the people who are authoring those plan documents were completely unaware? Is it something to do with the education?
There are two reasons for that. I think one is that traditional planners recognize no constraints. They didn't think of sustainability. So I would say one of the great failures of urban planners was not to have a public transport system in the 50s. I mean, I often wonder, Jawaharlal Nehru, whom I admire for many reasons, including his principal commitment to religious harmony and cultural diversity and democracy. I mean, he was an extraordinary figure in many ways. But he was a widely traveled man who knew the Paris metro, the Moscow metro, the London metro, and didn't think of a metro in Delhi, right? So I think that's one reason, that wasn't the idea that resources were scarce, that energy use could not be expanded infinitely, was, I think, a blind spot. The other reason has to do with actually a limitation of the second wave of Indian environmentalism. And this is something I've written about in the past, that the environmentalists of the 70s and 80s were all rural-based. They looked at forest, water, pasture, displacement. They turned their back on the city, like Gandhi himself turned his back on the city. I mean, now you may, for aesthetic reasons, turn your back on the city and see it as a source of contamination and corruption and greed. But for pragmatic reasons, you can't turn your back on the city because India is as much an urban civilization and always has been as a rural civilization. I think that's where, now the work of Patrick Geddes, whom I mentioned, and others, I think now maybe that has to come back into the conversation.
Yeah.
I think
You said in your excellent presentation that the remarkable Gadgil committee report was rejected by all the political parties. Is it that electoral democracy is inherently biased against environmentalism because people try to satisfy the immediate hunger of the people for consumerist well-being?
No, that's a very good question. I'd say there are two answers to that. One is, you're partly right, that a time horizon of 5 years you appeal to voters for instant gratification. So another way, that's a very good point. So, that, of course, we don't want authoritarianism. We don't want a ruler with a 40-year vision, right? We would like to have a chance to reassess our rulers, but that is an issue. So, for example, in a 5-year time horizon, another example would be the handouts. I mean, today's government is winning elections on a combination of Hindutva and handouts. There are also issues about the electoral system, about fair voting, but leave that. Let's assume voting is fair. I mean, I don't know enough about it. But the seductions of the Modi government in Maharashtra and elsewhere are Hindutva plus handouts. Now, handouts are again a substitute for good schools, good hospitals, and dignified employment, because those can't be provided in 5 years. So you're right. But there's another reason. And that is, our democracy is not decentralized. If the 73rd and 74th amendments were given teeth, if there was proper empowerment of panchayats and municipalities, where they could decide what to do with their water, their forests, their mining, their schools, you would have more responsible environmental and social management. I mean, this was shown in Karnataka, my home state. In the 1990s, we experimented with decentralization. We had an extraordinary socialist rural development minister called Abdul Nazeer Saab, who died in his early 50s. One of the most, there are people like this in Maharashtra, people in Maharashtra who started in the 70s, the EGS and so on. There have been some visionary state-level politicians who are truly cared for, social welfare. And that was started. So there was the empowerment of panchayats, and Gadgil himself and his team, who worked in the 1990s, found that forests, pasture, water were managed much better under a decentralized regime. But then the Janata government fell, and then afterwards, the politicians, the bureaucrats in Bangalore have decentralized everything. So it's many ways political decentralization, empowering smaller groups, which is in theory advocated under our constitution, but in practice those smaller groups don't have financial and administrative powers. Could be a way in which you have better. I mean, a very good example would be mining in the Adivasi belt. Okay, now, today you find a rich ore of, vein of ore. You just, whichever government is in Delhi, it could be a UPA government, it could be a BJP government, will give it to its favorite crony capitalists. And the entire, coal mine in Jharkhand or wherever Chhattisgarh will go. Now, if you have local Adivasi communities, and if you imaginatively interpret the fifth schedule, there are lawyers here who know this much better than I, if you imaginatively interpret the fifth schedule, you can say that it's a negotiation. We don't say no mining. We say it's a negotiation between our local communities and the mining company. So that we get employment, we get a stake, we get a share of profits. We tell you how to use it. Now, so I think these are ways in which political decentralization can actually be a vehicle both for social equity and for environmental sustainability. But now everything is, what the reversal in the last 10, 15 years is from the panchayat to the mantralaya, or in Karnataka to the Vidhan Sabha, and of course the last 10 years from Vidhan Sabha to PMO, which is all, which what that even theoretically, it removes the actors. It makes them farthest away from the consequences of their action. So they're not responsible for it. But these are all very large issues. And maybe last two questions. Yeah. Yeah, that lady there. That lady there. Yeah. Go ahead. And the one from there. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Guha, for a very important lecture. I'm curious about how within this now nascent within this nascent emerging third wave of environmentalism, how, given the widespread buy-in to colonial modes of city making, or in Mumbai, for instance, this obsession with the city that is world class.
I can't,
I'm curious about how we kind of unsettle, or in your research of environmental movements, how we unsettle kind of dominant narratives of what development can look like. Because even, for instance, in Mumbai with, the building of the coastal road, there was so much public buy-in, even from maybe certain sections of society that wouldn't benefit from, or that didn't own cars. And so how do we kind of undo that thinking?
No, I said that I alluded to. That we live in an increasingly brutal and authoritarian system, in which, and of course, one way would be, my only answer to that, a constructive answer to that would be, that that's why we need journalists of principle and integrity and fearlessness to report on these. Some of the best reporting, they still have some very brave, it would be unfair of me to take names of either individual writers or news outlets. But we should be thankful for those reporters and news outlets that still exist, that talk about these issues. Because the mainstream media will not talk about them. Parliament will not discuss them. So I think all of this, the violence on protesters, the kind of ramrod way in which policies are pushed through. I think whatever spaces that still exist, and hopefully also in the language press. One of the things I didn't talk about, but again, if someone was to do a study of the second wave of Indian environmentalism, a very important role would be in that wave was played by Indian language journalists. We know the famous English language journalists. But Rajkumar Keswani in Bhopal, who read Hindi, who alerted us to that. Writers in Garhwal in Hindi. In my own home state, Nagesh Hegde, extraordinary Kannada journalist. So they were the people, because they actually closer to the. Now in Malayalam, the poet Sugata Kumari in Malayalam, and people in Bengali. So I think this is where I think that's, in a sense, which is why this lecture in memory of Darryl is so important, because it is, again, as I said, whether one is an activist or not, one is trying to document closely, carefully, and things of real importance, and to do with some sincerity and courage and discipline and commitment. And I think the role of journalists like Darryl, both in what he did and the careers he shaped. I was telling Darryl's family, I knew Darryl, I liked him, I didn't know him all that well. I admired him, we were friends. He would come to Bangalore, I would come to his home in Bandra. We would follow each other's work. But, when I said, I'm coming to speak in Darryl's memory, people I had known for years said he was my mentor. So that kind of, that's where I think it's wonderful that what you're doing, because these small spaces of hope, of light, of documentation, of clarity, of truth-telling, I think that's where I think, so thank you for the host and thank you all for coming here, because I think that keeps all this alive, because eventually, things will get better, things will get better, the brutality and the authoritarianism will slowly dissipate. We don't know when and how, but I think sanity and reason and humanity, because history goes in cycles. History goes through dark and light phases, and I think that's, in my own lifetime I've seen it. I've lived, again, if I must one last thing about this, since you'll permit me, I'm a historian of the Republic. I've written about many, not just environmental, society, politics, economics. And if I was to look at the period since 1947, it's now 78 years, there have been 4 major crises we faced. We are currently living through the 4th crisis. But there were 3 previous ones. The first one I've only studied as a scholar, which is partition and afterwards. The second is the early 60s and mid-60s, which are of actually 5 crises. This is the 5th. The early 60s and mid-60s I remember, because I remember the wars with Pakistan and China. I remember the food scarcities. Then the emergency. I was a college student in Delhi. Then, of course, you had the horrors of the 80s and 90s and the communal violence. So there are ways in which nations can be reborn. And I think these spaces like this, and the example of people like Darryl and many people like him, including people still active, I think that's what must keep us going. Thank you.
Sir, last question. The question and answer session began by saying, why did you say there's really not a consolidated third wave?
Yeah.
Being here, we're speaking in Mumbai, I would give 2 glowing examples of surely probably the beginning of the third wave or somewhere in the middle, but the 2 examples are what Vanashakti did with Save Are Forest, the metro car shed, and what Nature Connect is doing in Navi Mumbai, the mangroves, wetlands, Parsik Hills. Stalin of Vanashakti and B.N. Kumar, I don't know if they are there. But I mean, these stories have gone beyond Mumbai, beyond Maharashtra, beyond India. My relatives, friends in Europe, America, Australia, they have heard of, Save Are. So I would say, there is a third wave. I don't know about the consolidation, but things are happening.
Thank you. I take it in the right spirit and may it grow, flourish, consolidate, and move around. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Please.
Yeah. No, and we wind up after.
Thank you for the lecture. And I am from Jharkhand, so I could relate with some of the things that you said. But, sir, my question is that 2 questions actually. Do you think there's a need to redefine environmentalism? Because you touched upon that, about the tiger reserves and the Chipko movement happening simultaneously. And we see that at a much larger scale right now, where 6 lakhs people, tribal Adivasis have been already displaced from the tiger reserves. One is that. And second question is like, if we are asking for political decentralization, and that is the demand or movement, then how can the response be unified? I feel that the response in every state will be different. Like in Jharkhand, there are movements going on against the commercial coal mining. So,
I absolutely agree. That's a very good point. That because we are a land of extraordinary ecological, cultural, and social and economic diversity, the responses also have to be at scale. But there can be some coordination. For example, if I was to go back to in the 1980s, you had in Maharashtra, Maharashtra was really the forefront of environmentalism in those days. So you had different groups working on forest and water. And there were people coordinating them, whether it is in Vidarbha or in Western Maharashtra or in the Sahyadri, there is still some. So I think interaction between different movements is I think what was, or the NAPM, which again, part of a study of the second wave would be a history of the NAPM, the National Alliance of People's Movement, what it did, what it could not do, to what extent it failed, what it succeeded, what it did nurture, what it did not nurture. So I think these are, but I agree with you that eventually the responses would have to be localized, but would have to be some coordination and some exchange of views and ideas, A, to learn from one another, and B, to present a broader front against, the forces that would otherwise overwhelm you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ram. Thank you very much.
We must thank Professor Ramachandra Guha for this excellent delivery as well as the thoughts that he's put forward. And just to a small recount, we had invited Mr. Ajit Ranade. You had also invited him. So I got onto the phone about 3 days ago with him. And he told me a very interesting thing. So he was head of Gokhale Institute before he was muscled out and edged out by the powers that be. And during the short spell he was there, I think you came and spoke at the Gokhale Institute. And somebody pointed out that for the last 9 years, none of the regular universities have ever dared to invite Ramachandra Guha for a lecture. Ultimately, this is the kind of platform that we call. And my friend Meena Menon alluded to that here's a guy with spine who's sort of trying to sum up history, ecology, environmentalism, trying to put it together. A university should be giving him more platforms. Students should be open and should be exposed to this kind of expositions. But universities in the current situation are absolutely have blacklisted speakers like Mr. Guha. So it's a great joy, and it's a great joy as a subaltern sort of push from the bottom to be able to welcome Dr. Guha to a platform like this. And again, talking about journalism and journalists and so far, our Bittu Sahgal's here in the audience, he will allude to it. That during the Mumbai Press Club runs the Red Ink Awards every year, and it's been going on for the last 12, 15 years. And Bittu and Meena have been sort of kind of anchoring the environmental section. There are about 10 or 15 sections. But you won't believe it, the largest number of entries are always for the environment. It's a great joy to be able to get 400, 500 entries, which shows the push this kind of thing has. But the other interesting thing is, these are all the youngsters. And as they grow up, they don't remain Kalpana Sharmas anymore. They just go into corporate reporting and to other reporting, and it gets blacklisted. When me, as part of Economic Times, there was a beat during the 90s, the labor beat. After liberalism, it was wound up. It's the fate also for environmental reporting. It doesn't remain a beat anymore. People who push for it and really get aggressive and muscle it. And that's where, you see, it was started by Darryl, and then it was adopted by a lot of newspapers. The more liberal papers, the left progressive papers adopted it, and slowly now it has been eased out. So that's something journalists here should really think about and what it is to be done. But frankly, I mean, the problems that we have, this is also part of the third wave trying to push forward. We should have more reporting. We should have more aggressive reporting. And people at the top in journalism should take care to be able to ensconce this within their system, which is not happening. So this is something which is a challenge, and I'm glad you sort of brought this up. And you know what is going to happen is these issues which we are discussing now, at least you say that you're not an activist, but at least that fires up a charge. And organizations like the Federation of Environmental Journalism, which Darryl set up, I think these have to be put together. We have to sort of forge these links much more. And the little that we are doing, the Mumbai Marathi Patrakar Sangh, the Mumbai Press Club, One Shakti, which is fighting on legal issues, so many other issues, and so many independent environmental groups which have come together to have this kind of a forum. A person like you speaking here, at least ideas to energize ourselves. That itself is activism. And I thank you all for coming. By your coming here, this fires up the subject more than that. And we try and keep this kind of forum alive. We welcome you to come as often as possible. Hopefully from once a year, we'll try and do it more often. But that is, as far as we go, I think it's a great step forward that at least we meet, we exchange ideas, and we hear great people like Mr. Ramachandra Guha come and sort of energize our ideas. Thank you so much for coming and taking your time off for this.